Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the pre-application meeting. This is for a proposed residential conservation district. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce the various members of the board in the township that are here. First of all, to my right on the panel here, Sue Jermovsik is here. Frank Schindler, Andy Lingefelder. I'm Rich Peterson. I'm the current chairman. We rotate that position annually. Our three Concord trustees, Amy Lucci, Morgan McIntosh, and Carl Dondorfer are here, as is Andy Rose, our township administrator, and Marty, and Heather, our zoning staff. So with that in mind, the purpose of this particular meeting is for the purpose of considering a sketch plan for the proposed residential conservation development requested by Mr. Greg Summers of Summers Real Estate Group, LLC, pursuant to section 16.28 of the Concord Township zoning resolution. So could I have the applicant come up and give us your name and your address and kind of explain your project and what you want to do?
Good evening, Greg Summers, Summers Real Estate Group, 8500 Station Street, Mentor, Ohio. Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. Thanks for setting this meeting up. As we've submitted, we've worked with Mr. Radacci and Heather to come up with an RCD plan for the subject property. As we all know, part of the process is that we have to submit a sketch plan with the ultimate goal of coming up with an RCD plan that minimizes infrastructure, lessens the need to impact wetlands, streams, etc. One of the challenges with that is that we have to use preliminary data. Full engineering is not required. So to get to this point, you see up on the board is the yield plan, and then we have an RCD plan that accompanies that we feel definitely meets those goals. The RCD plan has the green background there. We pretty much avoid almost all wetland impacts on that, and same with streams. Like I said, one of the challenges that we'd like to discuss tonight is that there's some question about the accuracy of the GIS data with where the streams are at, the wetlands, and we know that we have to get in and locate all those with real-world data. But even there's a lot of subjectivity with the yield plan process, which has made this a challenge. We've gone back a half dozen iterations of the plan with Heather, Mr. Radacci, to get to this point. But we feel that we've met the ultimate goal to come up with a plan that the RCD ordinance is specifically intends on any development plan. Like I said, you can see how much green space we're preserving, very minimal wetland impacts, less stormwater runoff, less infrastructure. And again, one of the things we're going to discuss tonight is, there may be some inaccuracies in some of the data that we have to use early on. But we also have the right under the yield plan to present a plan that would require wetland impacts. We do have the right to come in and impact wetlands, impact streams, but we don't want to do that. That's not the intent of the RCD code. So, again, that's been one of the subjects we've had to discuss. But the ultimate goal is to come up with the RCD plan that meets all the intents of that code. We've also met with Chad from Soil and Water. He concurred that the RCD plan is obviously the preferred plan. And I know that we are going to discuss some of the elements of the process of a yield plan, which again are somewhat subjective and somewhat challenging to work through. But we feel with the data that we have access to at this point, we've come up with the best scenario with what the RCD code is ultimately intended for. So,
okay. Any questions on the board? I just have one, Greg. A couple years ago, we adapted the riparian setbacks. Did you take all of those requirements into consideration in your plan? We did, okay. And especially on the RCD plan is which will ultimately be the plan that's built. Right. But we also made it a priority to take in consideration the riparian setbacks on the wetlands and streams on the yield plan. But we do show that with the yield plan that we would have to impact some wetlands and be within those areas. But again, the yield plan's never intended to be the plan that we want to build and be within those areas. So yes, heavy emphasis on the RCD plan, which is the one that we'd ultimately build to avoid all of those areas. Very good, thank you. Is there anybody from either Concord Township or Lake County that would like to address any matters related to this proposal? If so, please step forward.
My name is Chad Edgar, Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District, 125 East Erie Street. Kind of been nominated by the group to speak. We've had some internal meetings. I did meet with Greg last week and we discussed the plans. I do think the RC&D plan is better than the yield plan as proposed. You know, we look at streams and wetlands as green infrastructure. They provide critical functions and services for the township when it comes to stormwater. So we want to get that right. We want to get it accurate. So it's kind of our position right now in terms of the township, planning commission, stormwater engineers, and our office, that yield plan is not accurate at this point in time. We think there should be some revisions to it. You know, Greg spoke about the errors in the map. The county GIS contours that you see on the yield plan have less than 1 foot of vertical and less than 1.5 foot of horizontal error in them. They're free to use. 30 seconds with an ink pen, I think we'd have a pretty good idea where those streams are. 150 feet on one stream, 100 feet of error on the other. So there's about 6 lots that come into play that would be impacted by that stream or the setbacks. And they could propose mitigation for that, for sure. If they were to mitigate for the impacts with the yield plan as shown, it's about a $700,000 mitigation bill with 3-to-1 ratio for the class 3 stream, 1-to-1 ratio for some of the other streams, a 2-to-1 ratio on the wetland mitigation, which is at about $50,000 an acre right now. So, you know, that could be done, it could be proposed, but that's going to put your average lot at around $80,000 to $85,000 break even with your engineering costs, the purchase cost of the property, mitigation, et cetera, which really isn't marketable compared to some of the other lots that are half acre in that area. So we'd like to see that revised to come up with something that's a little bit more marketable, a little bit more reasonable. And that will affect the yield, the density bonus on the RCD plan. But we are encouraged that we are seeking the RC&D. It will obviously be a better project. We'd like to see basins added, at least the location of basins to the yield plan. Those are a requirement of the sketch plan per the county subdivision rules. That would obviously have another couple of lots potentially, or if they would like to propose mitigation, you know, again, the economics of that come into question, and whether that's a marketable, reasonable plan. Let's make sure I've covered all the bases that we discussed. Riparian setbacks, there's a couple of lots shown on both that yield plan and the RCD that have basically 0 offset from the setback to the house. So from a practical standpoint, it's going to be very difficult to construct. It does meet the code. You don't have to have any setback from the setback, but it doesn't really leave you any area to grade to have a nice lawn. They can establish lawns in that, but you can't come in and put any fill. You can't smooth that out. You can just remove the trees and plant grass seed. So that becomes kind of problematic. So we just like to make sure that the yield plan is as accurate as possible. We understand Greg's point that you don't have to go through the full engineering, but still think that there's some room to improve that plan.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Dave, would you like to?
Dave Verdacci, Lake County Planning and Community Development Director, and Secretary of the Planning Commission, Subdivision Administrator-ish. On the yield plan and on the RCD plan, the roads meet county standards. At the end of each one of the stubs, they're proposing to put T-intersection hammerheads. Those would require a variance from the subdivision regulations on both the RCD plan and on the yield plan. That would be a variance to the subdivision regulations, but it is a common variance on these short stubs to do the hammerheads, and almost to the point where ever since the fire code came out, we changed our variance requests to you pick one of these alternate other than a standard 110-foot cul-de-sac, which would not fit at the end of these stub streets. Like Chad had said, there are several lots that our subdivision regulations require that the lots meet zoning, and there were questions about 6 of the lots on meeting riparian setbacks on the yield plan. The location of the stream really needs to be nailed down to determine if those lots meet riparian setbacks or not. It was my belief that those lots, the stream was not in the right location, and there are at least 5 lots that would have to be would not be allowed in a standard subdivision. So,
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Anybody else have any comments out there? On the board, I have one question, Greg. On your R1, I happen to notice this afternoon, on your R1 yield plan, you show 2 streets coming off to the side, one tentatively called Thompson Court and the other one called Summers Court. And when I looked at Google Earth, it looked like Thompson Court would tie into an existing street adjacent. Is that correct?
It's the way it's planned would be for future connectivity
There is a road coming out of that street to the east.
to nature and
stuff.
nature preserve.
Yeah, and I thought it was,
South.
I thought that was gonna tie in. It doesn't immediately?
Not immediately. It's set up for future connectivity.
So there's, okay, and that's the R1 plan. In the RCD plan, it only shows, it eliminates Thompson and it goes strictly with Summers. So in other words, you only have one way in to this neighborhood?
There's one primary means of ingress and egress, and when we met with Mr. Radachi, that follows the code for the way it would be developed now, with potential future connectivity to the development with the substreet.
So for fire and rescue, though, there'd be one entrance?
And we met with the chief to go over the plan for the hammerhead and the turnarounds,
Okay. And
to meet the code the way it would be designed.
Okay. No problem with that, Heather?
No, just a clarification, we met with the Deputy Chief, Ron Terriaco, to discuss that.
Sorry,
Okay.
apologize.
That's
Yeah.
okay, yeah.
Because it was always, one of my understandings was that the state law required 2 entrances. We had a big
Right.
to-do at Aria's Way trying to get 2 entrances into that development. You only need one? He can get by with one?
I know that our Deputy Fire Chief has reviewed the RCD plan, and
Okay.
it was acceptable to him as
Okay,
far as.
if it's acceptable to him, it's fine by me. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Peterson, just a quick point on that statement.
Uh-huh.
On the, per the subdivision regulations, if the property that Summers Court attaches to, if it were ever to develop, we would force that road, Summers Court, to go back to Colburn or to another point to
Okay.
add that second entrance. When Concord Ridge was developed, it had 2 entrances in and out, and then it had a stub going into Lily Farm. And when Mr. Summers brought in Lily Farm, they originally proposed a cul-de-sac for that street, and we required them to go out to Winchell in order to provide a 3rd entrance into Concord Ridge. So we, as part of the subdivision regulations, we would probably, in the future, that would eventually connect into Colburn and provide a second entrance in and out of the subdivision.
Okay, very good, thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, Greg, after the things that were mentioned so far, do you have any problem with,
Well, again, I met with Chad and we had a tactful discussion on this point. Economics aren't part of the code. It's a reasonable and marketable theoretical scenario. What you could build that wouldn't be ideal, essentially, is what a yield plan is. And that stream back there, I mean, mitigation isn't cheap, but like I said, economics shouldn't be factored into this. It's reasonable and marketable lots, which there's plenty in Concord that have walkouts and topography and overlook creeks. And, even if we were to get this permitted, you're allowed certain acreages, certain stream impacts. We could still make it a viable development, but it wouldn't be ideal in synchrony with what the code was intended to provide. The code's written, extensive engineering, costs aren't required. Show us what you could theoretically do that wouldn't necessarily be ideal, and then show us what the ideal scenario is.
Okay.
And we feel strongly that we've done that. Again,
Okay.
if the stream is a little bit off, there is a chance that yield plan could require expensive mitigation, which we wouldn't want to grade streams, fill wetlands.
Right.
I agree. I'm not disagreeing with Chad on that, but the intent of the yield plan is a perfect example of the RCD process.
okay,
We don't want to build that. We don't want to impact. We don't want to spend the money. We don't want to impact streams, environmental features. So, again, we feel pretty strongly that this is accomplishing what it's meant to accomplish.
okay,
we're not going back. If we had to go back and redesign that, we'd have to do all types of engineering, and, you can't really do that. You can put the cart before the horse. You have to work with limited data to come up with a scenario that ultimately leads you to the better scenario with the new development. We're pretty, like I said, we're pretty confident we've accomplished that.
Okay. Very good.
Now, see, to be honest with you, I respectfully disagree that the yield plan truly reflects what can be done. I have a tendency to agree with the county officials that there's a number of lots in here that are extremely challenged. And I think the intent on a yield plan is to give us an accurate view, because there's a density bonus that is derived from that number. And, obviously it's to your benefit to put as many lots in there as you can, because then that'll qualify for a bigger density bonus with that regard. But I don't think that this yield, when I looked at the yield plan, I saw a lot of issues, with lots that are laid out in here. I don't think they would technically, I don't think they're lots that would ultimately come to fruition if you were to stick with a true R1, development. So, I think that there's more work that could be done on this yield plan to more accurately represent what can be built and what can't be. Because at the end of the day, you're right. A yield plan is supposed to give us a general idea, but when you're putting lots and homes on unbuildable property, and demonstrating that as a part of the density to derive your density bonus, I think that's a little disingenuous, in my opinion.
We worked with a half dozen revisions on the yield plan in the back corner where these streams are. And like I said, we met with Mr. Radacci on it. We shifted lots around. We made a conscious effort with the topo and all the data we had to try to make that the best case scenario. Even on the cul-de-sac there, we didn't want to show impacting the entire wetland. We turned the lots on the second stub street facing the stub street versus the main road. So we made a conscious effort to try to work with the data we had to make it the most accurate scenario that we could with the data that we had.
What was your reasoning for deleting the Thompson Court, the other ingress or egress with the RCV plan?
It had to do with the subdivision regulations, because once you get past a certain lineal footage of road, you have to add another stub street. So we designed it according to the subdivision regulations with the amount of road footage that you'd have. Because if you look at the plan, the road's a lot shorter on the RCD plan. So we eliminated that to comply with the code with the reduced length in street. And I appreciate the feedback on the yield plan. I just wanted to make it known that we worked for months and went back a half dozen times to the drawing board with all the data that we had to try to make that work. So,
Well, I don't disagree with that. I'm not challenging the amount of effort that you put into to come up with the yield plan. I'm sure you did. I'm just questioning the end result. That's all. I just feel that there's a few lots in here that are very challenged, and I think to include that into the density bonus, to include that into your yield plan and then use that as a tool to calculate your density bonus, I think is a little. I just think it's a little overboard. I would feel a lot better if I saw a few of these houses removed, a couple of these lots removed from the yield plan. It would make more sense. It would just, if you were just to go with a true, R1, development, I think you would agree too that there's probably some lots in here that they're not gonna happen.
yeah, that's
Unless you're willing, and then again, I don't know what your financial wherewithal is and whether or not you're willing to do the mitigation that's required. Listening to the numbers, it sounds like would be pretty expensive, and I'm sure it would become cost prohibitive. So I would think that there's probably gonna be a handful of lots in there that are gonna, they're just probably gonna go away. It just doesn't make sense, financially.
Yeah, that's the tough part about the yield plan process. Even, we've built other communities in the township, and went through it on Concord Ridge and Lily Farm. Like even on Concord Ridge, there was tons of wetlands that were shown on the yield plan, but ultimately they were condensed down and we got reasonable density, but never had to go anywhere near all that. So it's tough to work within those parameters, and we've talked with Heather about that. It would be easier if there was just, you know, a set parameter for here's conservation, here's the open space. You're trying to design something that's not realistic to build, but prove that you could build it. That's the tough part.
Well,
So
and I
it's-
think it's important to note that when we came up with the concept of the RCD, you know, what we didn't want to do, or what we wanted to do was encourage builders to consider that as an option, and what we didn't want to do was we didn't want builders to use that as an option or an excuse to dump the unbuildable property into the open space. You know, there's got to be a quality. I think there's got to be a trade-off, you know, of quality open space and resource protection, you know, with regards to the RCD plan and the intent behind it. Like I said, the intention was to encourage you to do this, and I'm thankful that you're considering that. Okay, but then in the same token, it's not that the open space is not to be used as an excuse to cover areas that wouldn't have been buildable anyway, and then use that to utilize that for a density bonus. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So so I understand what you're saying, but I think, you know, if you understand the intent of the zoning designation, there's got to be a balance between what's being chosen as open space and not just choosing property that otherwise wouldn't be developable anyway. But oh look, we're gonna make that open space. Well, more than likely it would have been open space anyway. And more than likely they're not going to build on it. So, but I think you did, and I think the RCD plan, it looks good. I don't have a whole lot of issues with that. There's a few lots in there that I question a little bit, but I think overall the RCD plan looks a lot better. I think you guys did a nice job.
I appreciate it. We're willing to work with everybody like we have to date and trying to get it to, you know, to where it's the best it can be from both perspectives on the RCD and yield plan. So we're willing to look at every possibility.
Right.
Greg, Chad brought up water retention areas. Are those the areas you define as possible water quality feature? Is that?
On the RCD plan, yes, we didn't, so, you know, again, we did Lily Farm and Concord Ridge and never had to show water basins on the yield plan.
Okay.
And we were just made aware of that. That's why we didn't show them on the yield plan.
Okay.
We were just made aware that we had to show them. We've never had to show them before on the yield plan.
Okay.
So they can be on the lots and we can show them. They'll probably be longer linear features, but we weren't aware until very recently that that was even.
Fair enough. And no problem putting them on there, though?
No, I mean, they
Okay.
can,
Okay.
we verified with Mr. Rodachi, they could even be shown on the lots. Like I said, we never had to show them before. We didn't know that we had to
Okay.
on the yield plan.
Okay.
So,
Any other comments, questions, discussion on any of the topics related to this? Anybody? Okay, well,
Wait.
given that then,
Hold on a
sure.
second. Were there any other county agencies that wanted to speak on any of the items that may affect you?
thanks for the feedback.
Okay.
Appreciate your time.
All right, thank you.
I had a couple,
Oh,
I had a
okay.
couple comments from zoning
Please.
department staff. And it does sound like you're gonna make some modifications to the yield plan before you formally submit for the rezone. But I did want to point out on the yield plan itself, there are 2 sublots that do not meet the dimensional requirements for the required amount of frontage on the roadway. I know I let Greg know about that in advance. So sublots 22 and 23 don't have the 50-foot of frontage. So
Okay.
I don't know if they can revise that and show that those lots will meet that 50-foot of road frontage. I also kind of echo the same concerns that we heard from the county about the mismatch in the data and the mapping of the stream, particularly between the proposed sublots 19 and 23 on the yield plan. So I'd like to see the stream in a more accurate location so we can have a better idea as to whether or not those would actually comply.
Okay.
Also, I did notice, and when I was doing my due diligence on looking at both the plans, like for what you submitted, you've indicated that there were 29.63 acres of land within your proposed development. I looked on the auditor's site and it was slightly lower. It was 28.56. So, and I don't know if there's, you know, there's something different or something wrong with the legal descriptions online or with the plan itself, but one of the requirements when you do formally submit would be to provide the legal description, so I think we can figure that out when you submit that. But as far as the RCD plan, it really is the better way to develop the property. I just, there are a few lots on the yield plan though that I question, which is the basis of the density for the overall RCD. But in regards to the RCD plan as well, there were a couple proposed stormwater basins that looked like there was potential grading within the required riparian setbacks. So that wouldn't be permitted. You'd have to adjust those basins to make sure they weren't within the required riparian setbacks from any of the streams and wetlands that were going to remain on the property. But that's pretty much it. I think
Very
everything
good.
else has been covered.
Okay, if there's no other discussion, I guess the next step, Greg, would be you would make a formal application with a revised plan to the township, and that will be scheduled for a zoning commission meeting in the future and a public hearing, and we'll continue on from there and consider the change.
I do have a question. Dave, if you wouldn't mind. Based on the yield plan that we're seeing this evening, how many lots would you recommend for approval as a
Minus
base?
5.
Minus 5.
At least minus 5, and then there's a 6th one that Chad had concerns with that I really didn't explore any further than the 5, 19 through 23. I have concerns about because of the location of the stream and the riparian setback.
Right.
And then Mr. Egger stated and told me that he had concerns about the location of another stream further to the south that may affect another lot.
So you're saying on the far end of the of Chandler Court there, by the Stub Street, those lots basically from that Stub Street over
Yeah.
would probably
On the northeast side of the cul-de-sac and from the stub,
19 through 23.
yeah.
Okay.
And you're aware of that, Greg? Okay, okay. Very good.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. Any other question, comments? Frank?
Mine only was with Chad. I think once, Chad, you said there were inaccuracies in the yield plan, right?
I believe so.
So if those get fixed, I'm sure it's going to affect the layout of the development, correct?
Well, yeah, they'd have several options. They could just strike the lots and submit the roadway as it is if they don't want to go through those hurdles, or they could completely redesign the layout of the subdivision to try and, maybe they could fit one or two more of those stricken lots in if they do some minor tweakings to their radiuses and stub streets
Okay.
and so on. So different ways they could accomplish that.
Well, first I think you should take care of your concerns about the yield plan being correct.
Yeah,
That's the
obviously we want good
basis
data.
That's the basis that sets up the whole development.
Correct.
So once that's correct, then they can address the other issues that should be, of course, taken care of too.
Yes.
All right. That's my question. They should target that first, fix the errors in there, and I'm sure they'll address the lot sizes that Dave's concerned about for one thing too, how they're gonna be laid out.
Okay.
So, that's my
Because
recommendation.
both the two lots with the dimensional issues happen to be two of the 5 on that
Right.
northeast corner that have a stream issue as well. So
Gotcha.
both of those issues, I would assume, would be resolved at the same time.
22 and 23.
Yes.
Okay.
And the other lot, I believe, is 40. 40, yes, 40. So that stream, based on the county's maps, would flow directly through the building footprint on 40, rather than between 40 and 30.
Okay.
Which I think, with some frontage changes, right, Greg, you could probably adjust that, put that in there.
Yes, absolutely. And I can
Yeah, let's say that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we plan on doing aerial topography and all the engineering. It's just,
Okay.
it's early on, and to Heather's question, there was an inaccurate calculation. We have a new legal and boundary that we'll submit with the proper acreage calculation. I guess back, and again, we're gonna go back and look at what we can do on the yield plan, but even on the stream issue, if we get more accurate data, I mean, we're allowed to impact it and not even mitigate for stream mitigation to a certain degree. I guess we're just gonna have to work together to see what level of impacts we wanna show.
Understand.
That's what I was getting at, because even if we have accurate data, there might be a few lots that could be, I guess you'd say challenging, but they'd be buildable, scenic, nice lots, but
Sure.
there may be some different, additional costs associated with it. So we just have to balance that
Okay.
with you guys, with the county officials, and that's what I meant about the challenge on the yield plan. It's, we wouldn't, if we come back and it does show some impacts, we're ultimately don't want to impact that, but we might have to show it within, to a certain extent. So
Okay.
we'll go back and work on it and see how we can improve it.
The main thing is you clearly understand all the concerns that were brought to attention? Okay, good. Okay.
Thank
Then you would just have to resubmit your application or submit your application for the next consideration and then public hearing.
Appreciate it. Thanks again for the
Okay,
time
thank
and
you.
feedback. Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.
Anything else on the topic before we close the meeting? We have a regular scheduled zoning meeting roughly at 7 o'clock. We're going to take a 5-minute break after this meeting, allow people to leave that would like to leave and so forth. So anything else? If not, I'm going to close this meeting. Thank you.